Some women hold entire empires together with nothing but bare hands and a spine that refuses to break. And the day those women walk out, the empire learns what silence really sounds like. This is the story of a woman they never valued, until she was gone. If you have ever given everything to people who gave you nothing back, stay until the very end. This one will hit different. Drop a like and tell me. Comment the name of your city right now. Let me see where my people are watching from tonight. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor had that particular hum, the kind that crawls into your teeth after enough hours. Vivian Hart stood at the nurse's station on the third floor of Cook County's trauma wing, her scrubs stained with someone else's blood, her hands still trembling from the last code blue that didn't make it. 4 years as a combat medic in Kandahar had taught her how to hold steady when everything around her was falling apart. But stateside medicine had its own cruelty. Here, nobody shot at you. They just let you drown slowly under paperwork and budget cuts and the quiet understanding that saving lives was somehow never enough to justify a living wage. She was reviewing discharge notes when the charge nurse, a woman named Deborah, who had survived 30 years on this floor by turning her heart into something resembling a clenched fist, leaned over the counter. "Hart, you still here? Your shift ended 2 hours ago." "I know." "Then go home." The kid in 312 is cycling again. His O2 keeps dipping and nobody on nights is going to catch it. Deborah looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that meant she wanted to say something warm but couldn't afford to. Not on this floor. Not in this city. "You can't save everyone, Hart." Vivian didn't answer. She'd heard that line in the desert too, usually right before she proved it wrong. The ambulance came in at 2:47 a.m. Vivian was already gowned up, already moving before the paramedics had the gurney through the double doors. The patient was a man, mid-30s, expensive suit soaked through with blood from a chest wound. "Car accident," the paramedic said. "Steering column." But the way the blood was pooling told Vivian something else. This wasn't just blunt force. There was penetration, maybe a rib fragment into the lung. She could hear the wet sucking sound before they even got him under the lights. "What's his name?" she asked, already cutting fabric away from the wound site. "Calloway. Ethan Calloway." The name meant nothing to her. Not then. BP's crashing, 80 over 50 and dropping. Vivian's hands moved the way they always did in moments like this. Independent of fear, independent of doubt. She'd packed wounds in a forward operating base with mortar rounds shaking the walls. A trauma bay in Chicago was practically a spa by comparison. She found the bleed, clamped it, packed it, and barked orders at the resident who was standing there with the kind of frozen expression that told her he'd never seen this much blood coming out of one person before. "Hey, eyes on me. You're going to hold this clamp right here. You're going to hold it like your life depends on it because his does. Can you do that?" The resident nodded. His hands were shaking, but he held. 2 hours later, Ethan Calloway was stabilized. Vivian stepped out of the trauma bay, stripped her gloves, and stood in the hallway with her back against the wall. The shaking came then, the way it always came after. Not during, never during. Her body had learned to save the falling apart for when the work was done. Deborah found her there. "The Calloway kid. Do you know who he is?" "No." "His family owns half the commercial real estate on Michigan Avenue. Father's on the board of 3 hospitals, including this one." Vivian looked at her. "So?" "So nothing. I'm just telling you, the family's going to show up. And when they do, it's going to be a circus." She was right. By morning, the waiting room had transformed into something Vivian barely recognized. Private security stood at the doors. A woman in a charcoal coat that probably cost more than Vivian's car was speaking to the hospital administrator in a voice that carried the particular authority of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. That was Margaret Calloway. Vivian watched her from the end of the corridor, not out of curiosity, but from the professional distance she'd learned to maintain around the families of patients. Families were their own kind of wound. They could be grateful or they could be dangerous, and the rich ones were usually both. The administrator came to find Vivian an hour later. "Mrs. Calloway wants to meet the medic who stabilized her son." "I'm not a medic anymore. I'm a trauma nurse." "She wants to meet you." Vivian walked into the private room they'd moved Ethan to. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. Margaret Calloway stood by the window, her posture the kind of rigid that comes from a lifetime of refusing to appear vulnerable in front of strangers. She turned when Vivian entered. "You're the one who saved my son." "The surgical team saved your son, ma'am. I just kept him alive long enough for them to do their job." Margaret studied her. It was the kind of assessment Vivian recognized. Not medical, not professional, but social. Margaret Calloway was calculating exactly where Vivian fell on the scale of people who mattered. Vivian could feel herself being measured and found unremarkable. "Where did you train?" "Army, Forward Surgical Team 274th, 2 tours in Afghanistan." Something shifted in Margaret's expression, not respect exactly, more like recalibration, as if Vivian had just become slightly more complicated than the category Margaret had already filed her under. "Well, thank you. The family is grateful." The words were correct. The temperature behind them was about 40 degrees below genuine. Vivian had been thanked by commanding officers who meant it less, so she didn't take it personally. She nodded and left the room. But Ethan Calloway didn't leave her life that easily. His recovery was brutal. The chest trauma had been worse than the initial assessment suggested. Complications set in during the first week: infection, fluid buildup, a collapsed lung that required a second emergency procedure. Vivian wasn't his assigned nurse, but she kept checking on him during her shifts because something about the way he fought for each breath reminded her of the soldiers she'd treated who were too stubborn to die. He was awake on the 9th day when she came in to check his drainage tubes. "You're the one who keeps showing up at 3 a.m., he said. His voice was wrecked, barely more than a rasp. "I work nights." "You work all the time. The nurses talk." "Nurses always talk. It's how we stay sane." He tried to laugh and immediately regretted it, his hand going to his chest. Vivian adjusted his morphine drip without being asked. "Careful. You've got about 6 inches of surgical staples holding you together right now. Laughing is not recommended." "What is recommended?" "Staying alive. Not being stupid about it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time Vivian felt something shift in the room that had nothing to do with medical equipment. "What's your name?" "Vivian." "Ethan. But I guess you already know that." "I know your chart. That's not the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. The monitors beeped. The city hummed outside the window. "My mother told me the family is grateful. She used that exact word. Grateful." "That's a nice word." "It's a corporate word. She uses it in board meetings when she's about to fire someone." He paused, wincing as he shifted position. "I want to say something real. You saved my life." "Part of the job." "No, I talked to the paramedics. They told me what you did, the way you moved, the calls you made. That wasn't the job. That was something else." Vivian didn't know what to say to that. In the desert, people had thanked her before. Sometimes they meant it. Sometimes they were just high on the relief of still having a pulse. She'd learned not to build anything on gratitude because gratitude faded the moment the wound healed. "Get some rest, Ethan." "Vivian." "What?" "Thank you. And I don't mean it the way my mother does." She left the room before her expression could betray anything she wasn't ready to feel. The weeks turned into months. Ethan's recovery was slow and complicated. He developed a pulmonary embolism that nearly killed him a second time. He fought through physical therapy with the kind of grim determination that Vivian recognized from soldiers who refused to be defined by the damage. She found herself staying late, coming in on her days off, checking on him when she didn't need to. They talked. Not about his family's money or her lack of it. About real things. About the sound mortar fire makes at 4 a.m. and how you never really stop hearing it. About the way hospital ceilings look at 3 a.m. when the morphine starts wearing off and the pain comes back like a tide. About the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who need something from you every second of every day. "You know what the worst part of being a Calloway is?" he said one night, his voice low in the dark room. "Everyone assumes you've never suffered, like money is some kind of anesthetic. Isn't it? It numbs the small stuff. Rent, bills, whether you can afford the good coffee or the bad coffee. But the big stuff, the real stuff, money doesn't touch it." My father died when I was 19, heart attack at his desk. My mother found him. She hasn't been the same since. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just don't assume I don't know what pain is. I wasn't assuming anything? Yeah. He looked at her in that way he had, like he was trying to read something written in a language he was still learning. I know you weren't. That's why I keep talking to you. Vivian should have drawn the line then. She knew the rules. Patient-provider boundaries existed for good reasons. But Ethan Calloway had a way of making her forget where the lines were supposed to be. And by the time she remembered, she was already standing on the other side of them. He was discharged after 4 months. Vivian assumed that would be the end of it. Rich men recovered, went back to their lives, and forgot the people who'd kept them breathing in the dark. That was how the world worked. You patched them up, they walked away, and you stood there with blood under your fingernails, wondering why the gratitude always had an expiration date. But Ethan called her the next week, and the week after that. I'm not your nurse anymore, she told him over the phone. You know that, right? I know that. I'm not calling for medical advice. Then why are you calling? Because you're the only person in my life who doesn't want something from me. That sentence broke something open in her chest that she'd been keeping locked since Kandahar. The understanding that someone could see her not as a function, but as a person. It was the kind of recognition she'd stopped hoping for, the way soldiers stop hoping for mail after enough weeks of empty mailboxes. They started seeing each other. Dinners that weren't fancy because Vivian refused to let him take her anywhere that required a dress code she couldn't afford. Walks along the lakefront where the wind came off Lake Michigan like a cold slap, and Ethan's breathing still hitched on the steep parts because his lungs weren't fully healed. Coffee at the diner near her apartment where the waitress knew Vivian's order and looked at Ethan like she was trying to figure out why a man in a $3,000 watch was eating eggs at a Formica counter. Your mother's going to hate this, Vivian said one morning, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate. My mother hates everything that isn't on her approved list. Don't take it personally. I'm a combat medic turned trauma nurse from a no-name town in downstate Illinois. I'm pretty sure I'm not on any list your mother has ever written. Vivian? What? I don't care about her list. He meant it. She could tell because his jaw did that thing it did when he was being stubborn about something, and Ethan Calloway was the kind of man who wore his stubbornness like a second skeleton. But meaning it and surviving it were two different things. And Vivian had been around enough powerful families, in the military, in the hospital hierarchy, in the quietly vicious social structures of Chicago's upper class, to know that love was never enough to outrun the machinery of status. Margaret Calloway confirmed this on the first and only occasion Ethan brought Vivian to the family estate in Winnetka. The house was the kind of beautiful that felt like a threat. Marble floors, 20-foot ceilings, art on the walls that probably cost more than Vivian would earn in a decade. Margaret met them in the foyer, dressed in something that looked effortless in the way only extremely expensive things can look effortless, and her smile had the precision of a weapon that had been calibrated for exactly this kind of encounter. So you're the nurse? I am. Ethan tells me you served in the military. I did. That must have been quite an experience. The way she said it. Like Vivian's service was a curiosity, a strange detour in a life that Margaret had already decided was beneath detailed examination. Dinner was worse. Ethan's younger sister, Caroline, was civil but watchful. His uncle Richard, who managed the family's investment portfolio, spent the meal asking Vivian questions that were designed to expose what she didn't know about finance, wine, real estate, and the particular social grammar of people who had never worked a job where their hands got dirty. Vivian answered every question with the same steady calm she'd used when field commanders questioned her medical decisions. She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She didn't pretend to be something she wasn't. But afterward, in the car, she was quiet. That was a test, she said. I know. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just tell me the truth. Is it always going to be like that? Ethan gripped the steering wheel. The city light slid across the windshield like something falling. I'll talk to her. That's not what I asked. He didn't answer. And his silence told her everything his words wouldn't. They married 6 months later. Small ceremony. A judge Ethan knew. No family from her side because there wasn't any family to speak of. Her mother had died when Vivian was 15. Her father had checked out long before that, the slow-motion departure of a man who'd decided that responsibility was a country he no longer wanted to live in. She'd raised herself in the spaces between foster homes and public libraries and eventually the Army recruiting office, which was the first institution that ever looked at her and said, "You're exactly what we need." Margaret did not attend the wedding. She sent flowers, white lilies, the kind people send to funerals. Vivian understood the message. She put the flowers in water anyway because wasting something beautiful out of spite was a luxury she'd never learned to afford. Moving into the Callaway world was like stepping into a current that looked calm on the surface but could pull you under if you stopped kicking for even a second. Vivian left her nursing job. Ethan asked her to, and she agreed because he was still recovering, still needed monitoring that he was too proud to ask for from anyone else. She became his caretaker, his confidant, his anchor. The role expanded without anyone naming it. She managed his medication schedule, his physical therapy appointments, his nutritional needs. When complications arose, she was the one who caught them early, who recognized the signs, who made the calls that kept setbacks from becoming catastrophes. But inside the Callaway household, none of this translated into standing. Margaret ran the family with the administrative precision of a woman who had been trained since birth to understand that wealth was not money, but power. And power required constant maintenance. She had Sunday dinners. She had family meetings. She had opinions about every decision Ethan made, every direction the family's business interests moved, every detail of household life from the china patterns to the charitable foundations. Vivian was invited to none of it. "You don't need to be involved in family business," Margaret told her one evening, her tone so smooth it almost disguised the blade underneath. "I'm family." "You're Ethan's wife. There's a difference." Vivian felt that sentence land the way she'd felt shrapnel land. The impact first, the pain a half-second later. She didn't flinch. She'd been trained better than that. But something in her chest tightened, a cord being wound one more turn around a spool that was already close to breaking. The years accumulated like scar tissue. Vivian learned the rhythm of being tolerated. She learned which rooms to enter and which ones to avoid when Margaret was present. She learned to read the temperature of a conversation by the way Caroline glanced at her mother before speaking. She learned that Richard talked over her at every dinner table, not because he was rude, although he was, but because in his world, certain people simply didn't occupy space that required acknowledgement. She also learned that she was the only person in the family who noticed when things were falling apart. It started small. Ethan's business decisions growing erratic. Phone calls at midnight that left him staring at the ceiling. Liquor bottles appearing in his study that emptied faster than they should have. Vivian recognized the pattern because she'd seen it in soldiers after deployment. The slow descent into a numbness that looked like functioning from the outside, but was actually the systematic dismantling of everything that made a person capable of feeling. "You're drinking too much," she told him one night. Direct, no decoration. The way she'd learned to deliver hard truths in the field, where softening the blow could get someone killed. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Your hands are shaking at 10 a.m. and you missed the board meeting yesterday because you couldn't get out of bed. That's not fine." "Don't manage me, Vivian." "Someone has to." He looked at her with something that might have been anger, or might have been the particular shame of a man who knows he's being seen clearly for the first time. "I said I'm fine." She didn't push it, not then, but she started quietly intercepting the damage. When Ethan missed a deadline, Vivian called his assistant and covered for him. When he forgot a client dinner, she showed up in his place with apologies and enough charm to hold the relationship together. When financial documents piled up unsigned on his desk, she organized them, flagged the urgent ones, and left them where he'd find them first thing in the morning. She became the invisible architecture holding the Callaway machine together. And because she was invisible, nobody noticed. Nobody except Margaret, who noticed everything but chose to interpret it differently. "You're overstepping," Margaret said one afternoon, standing in the doorway of Ethan's study while Vivian reorganized the filing system that hadn't been touched in months. "I'm helping." "You're inserting yourself into business matters that don't concern you." Ethan is behind on 3 quarterly reports. The board is asking questions. If someone doesn't handle this, it's going to be a problem. The family will handle it. The family doesn't know it's happening. Margaret's eyes narrowed, not in surprise, in recognition. She knew Vivian was right, and she hated her for it. This is a Calloway matter. You are not a Calloway. I'm Ethan's wife, and I've already explained to you what that means in this house. Margaret turned and walked away. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with the precise rhythm of a woman who had never questioned whether the ground beneath her was solid. Vivian stood in the study, alone with the stacked files and the silence and the growing understanding that she could save this family from itself and they would still find a reason to treat her like the help. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from the body. It comes from the soul, from the place where a person stores the belief that their efforts mean something. Combat had taught Vivian how to function past physical collapse. She could operate on 2 hours of sleep, could make life and death decisions with her hands numb and her vision blurring. But this was different. This was the slow erosion of meaning itself, the growing suspicion that no amount of sacrifice would ever change her position in a family that had decided on her worth before she'd ever walked through the door. She started keeping a bag packed, not consciously at first. She'd place a change of clothes in a duffel near the closet, add her passport, her discharge papers, the small things that represented the life she'd built before Ethan, the identity that existed independent of the Calloway name. The final dinner was on a Thursday. Vivian had spent the afternoon resolving a vendor dispute that could have cost the family's hospitality division a $250,000 contract. She'd made calls, negotiated terms, smoothed over the damage that Ethan's absence had created. She came to dinner tired but functional, the way she always came to dinner, present, composed, ready to absorb whatever the evening required. Margaret was already seated. Caroline was on her phone. Richard was pouring himself a scotch that he didn't offer to share. "Vivian," Margaret said, not looking up from her salad, "I've been meaning to discuss something with you." "All right." "The family is considering some changes to Ethan's role in the company. Given his recent difficulties, we think it might be best if he stepped back from daily operations." "Have you discussed this with Ethan?" "We're discussing it now." "He's not here." "No, he's not." Margaret set down her fork. "But you are. And since you seem to have made yourself quite comfortable in his business affairs, I thought you might appreciate the courtesy of hearing it first." The word courtesy landed like a slap delivered with a white glove. Vivian understood exactly what was happening. Margaret wasn't informing her. She was drawing a line, telling Vivian that the family would handle Ethan, that Vivian's involvement was not only unnecessary but unwelcome, that whatever she had done to keep the ship from sinking would be erased and replaced by the official Calloway version of events. "You're going to push him out of his own company," Vivian said. "We're going to protect the family's interests." "And what about Ethan? Ethan is a Calloway. We protect our own. You protect your name. That's not the same thing." Silence. Caroline looked up from her phone. Richard stopped pouring. Margaret's expression didn't change. It was the stillness of a woman who had been challenged before and never lost. "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that you have misunderstood your place in this family." "No." Vivian stood. Her chair scraped against the marble. "I understand it perfectly. That's the problem." She walked out of the dining room, down the hallway with its portraits and its art and its carefully curated evidence of generational success. She went upstairs. She sat on the bed in the room she shared with Ethan, a room that had never quite felt like hers, and she looked at the duffel bag she'd been packing for months without admitting to herself what it meant. Ethan came in an hour later. He looked wrecked. The particular kind of wrecked that comes from a conversation with Margaret that you lost before it started. "She told me about the board changes," he said. "And?" "And I told her to go to hell." He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "For all the good it'll do." "Ethan, I know what you're going to say." "You don't." He looked at her. The room was dark except for the light coming in from the hallway, and in that half-light his face looked older than his years, carved by the kind of attrition that money couldn't prevent and status couldn't disguise. "Then tell me." "I'm leaving." The words sat between them like a detonation. He stared at her. Not with shock exactly, with the particular devastation of a man who had been expecting this moment for years and had spent every one of those years pretending it wouldn't come. "Vivian, don't." I've been holding this together with my bare hands, Ethan. Your business, your health, your family's messes, and every single day I do it, your mother looks at me like I'm something she needs to scrape off her shoe. I'll talk to her. You've been saying that for 4 years. I mean it this time. You meant it every time, that's not the point. He reached for her hand. She let him take it, not because she was staying, but because she wanted to remember what it felt like to be held by someone who loved her, even if his love had never been strong enough to protect her from the people who didn't. I can't keep being the person who saves everyone and gets nothing, not even acknowledgement, not even a seat at the table. You have a seat at the table. I have a chair in the room, Ethan. That's not the same thing, and you know it. He dropped his head. His shoulders curved inward. She watched the man she loved collapse into himself like a building whose support beams had finally given out, and she understood with terrible clarity that she had been one of those beams. Maybe the only one. But a beam can only bear so much weight before it either breaks or decides to stop holding. Vivian chose to stop holding. She left before dawn. No note. No forwarding address. She took the duffel bag, her discharge papers, her nursing license, and the parts of herself that she'd managed to keep intact despite 4 years of being treated like a guest in her own life. The Calloway estate was quiet when she walked out the front door. The marble foyer gleamed under the security lights. The portraits watched her go with their painted, indifferent eyes. She drove south on Lakeshore Drive with the windows down and the early morning cold filling the car like water, filling a space that had been empty for too long. She didn't cry. Crying was for people who were surprised by loss, and Vivian Hart had never been surprised by anything since Kandahar. She drove until the skyline disappeared behind her, until Chicago became a memory, until the road was just road and the sky was just sky, and the woman in the driver's seat was just a woman who had finally stopped saving people who refused to see her. Back in Winnetka, Margaret Calloway came downstairs at 7 a.m. to find the house exactly as she'd left it the night before, except lighter somehow, emptier, as if something structural had been removed while she slept. She poured her coffee. She opened her morning briefing folder. She didn't ask about Vivian. It would be 3 weeks before anyone in the Calloway family said Vivian's name out loud. And by then, every single system she had quietly maintained, every relationship she had preserved, every crisis she had deflected, every piece of damage she had absorbed so that the Calloways could continue believing in their own invincibility, had already begun to unravel. The cracks started in the foundation, where they always start, where nobody thinks to look until the whole structure begins to shift, and the sound of something breaking fills every room in the house. And Margaret Calloway, standing in her perfect kitchen with her perfect coffee and her perfect certainty that she had protected her family from an intruder, had no idea that the only person who had ever truly protected them had just driven away with nothing but a duffel bag, and the quiet, devastating knowledge that some people will never see what holds them up until it is already gone. The cracks started with the coffee. Margaret Calloway had a particular way of taking her morning cup, black, no sugar, served at exactly 6:45 a.m. in the bone china that had belonged to her mother-in-law. For 23 years, that cup had appeared on the kitchen island at the same time, in the same place, without Margaret ever having to ask. First, the housekeeper managed it. Then, for the last 4 years, Vivian had taken over the morning routine so seamlessly that nobody noticed the transition. On the 4th morning after Vivian left, Margaret came downstairs to find no coffee, no briefing folder, no organized mail. The kitchen was clean but empty in a way that felt less like tidiness and more like abandonment. She made her own coffee. She burned it. Such a small thing. The kind of detail that shouldn't matter to a woman who controlled a family worth 9 figures. But the burned coffee was the first domino, and Margaret Calloway, standing in her kitchen with a cup of something bitter and wrong, had no idea how many dominoes were lined up behind it. Ethan didn't come downstairs that morning, or the next. Caroline found him on the 3rd day, sitting in his study with the curtains drawn and a bottle of Blanton's that was 3/4 empty. The room smelled like a man who had stopped caring whether anyone noticed he was falling apart. "Ethan, it's 2 p.m. I know what time it is. Have you eaten?" "I'm not hungry." "That wasn't what I asked." He looked at his sister with eyes that had gone flat. The particular deadness of someone who had been running on borrowed energy for years and had just lost the source. Caroline had seen that look once before, on their father, in the weeks before his heart gave out. The recognition hit her like ice water. You need to get up. Why? Because the Morrison Group called, twice. Something about the Q3 contracts you were supposed to sign last week. Vivian handled the Morrison account. The sentence sat in the room like a confession nobody had asked for. Caroline stared at her brother. What do you mean Vivian handled it? I mean, she handled it. The way she handled everything. The calls, the follow-ups, the relationship management, all of it. Ethan, that's a $14 million account. I know what it's worth. And you let your wife manage it? He took a drink. The bourbon caught the light from the crack in the curtains. Amber, almost beautiful, the way destruction sometimes is when you're watching it from far enough away. I didn't let her do anything. She saw it needed doing, and she did it. That's what Vivian does. Did. Caroline stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, trying to calculate how many other things in the Callaway operation had been held together by a woman they'd all treated like furniture. The math was starting to look catastrophic. I'm calling Mom. Don't. Someone has to. Mom is the reason she left. You call Mom into this and it gets worse. It's already worse, Ethan. You're sitting in the dark drinking at 2 p.m. and we're about to lose a $14 million client because nobody knows where the files are. He finished his drink, set the glass down with the careful precision of someone who knows they're one pour away from not being able to set it down at all. The files are in the third drawer of the credenza in the guest office. Vivian kept them organized by quarter, color-coded, green tabs for active, yellow for pending, red for urgent. How do you know that? Because she told me. She told me everything. I just didn't listen. Caroline went to the guest office. She found the credenza. She pulled the third drawer open and stood there for a long time looking at what was inside. Color-coded files, dozens of them, each one labeled in Vivian's precise handwriting. Not the handwriting of a woman playing at business, but the handwriting of someone who had been trained to document under fire, where clarity could mean the difference between a soldier living and dying. Morrison Group Q1 to Q4. Henderson Properties Dispute Resolution. Callaway Foundation Donor Management. Board Presentation Drafts. Tax Correspondence. Insurance Claims. A section at the back labeled Family, Personal, which contained medical records for every family member, updated prescriptions, allergy information, emergency contacts organized by proximity and availability. Caroline pulled out the family file and opened it. Inside was a single page in Vivian's hand that listed the warning signs of Ethan's potential relapse into the drinking that had started after his accident, along with intervention protocols she'd researched, and a list of treatment facilities ranked by success rate and discretion. She had prepared for this, for the moment when she wouldn't be here to catch him. Caroline sat down on the guest office floor with the file in her lap and felt something crack open in her understanding of the woman she'd spent 4 years treating as a background character in her family's story. The Morrison Group pulled their account 6 days later. Richard was the one who took the call. He came into the family room where Margaret was reviewing invitations for the fall gala and dropped the news like a body. Morrison's out. Excuse me? Ted Morrison called. He said, and I'm quoting here, that without Mrs. Callaway handling their relationship, he doesn't trust us to manage a parking lot, let alone his portfolio. Margaret set down her reading glasses. He said that. He said that. Ted Morrison has been with this family for 11 years. He was with Vivian for 4. Apparently that counted for more. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Margaret's jaw tightened, a small movement, barely visible, but Caroline was watching from the hallway and she saw it. The first fracture in the armor of a woman who had spent a lifetime making sure her armor didn't fracture. We'll find another contact, someone from Ethan's team. Ethan doesn't have a team anymore, Margaret. He has a bottle in a dark room, and the 2 people on his staff who actually knew what they were doing both quit last month because Vivian was the one who managed their workload, and without her they were drowning. Then hire replacements. With what references? The last 3 candidates I contacted asked about the working environment, and when I told them the situation, they declined. Word gets around. People in this industry talk. People in this industry work for money. Offer more. Richard poured himself a drink. He didn't offer Margaret one, which in the particular language of the Calloway family was an act of mild rebellion that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. You know what Ted Morrison said to me before he hung up? He said Vivian was the only person in this family who ever returned a phone call within an hour. He said she remembered his daughter's name, his daughter's birthday. She sent a gift when the kid graduated from 8th grade, a book about marine biology because the kid wants to be a marine biologist. That's a lovely story, Richard. It doesn't solve our problem. That is our problem, Margaret. She knew things. She paid attention to things. She held relationships together with the kind of personal investment that you can't hire, you can't outsource, and you sure as hell can't replace with a check. Margaret stood. Her posture was perfect, the way it always was. A spine that had been straightened by decades of refusing to bend for anyone or anything. But there was something in her eyes that Caroline hadn't seen before. Not guilt. Margaret Calloway did not do guilt. But the earliest, faintest stirring of doubt. The kind that gets in through the cracks you didn't know you had. I will not discuss this further. You're going to have to. I said I won't. She walked out of the room with the precise, measured steps of a woman maintaining control of a situation that was already beyond her control. Caroline watched her go and then looked at Richard. How bad is it? Richard set his glass down. Bad. How bad is bad? The Henderson dispute that Vivian was managing, it just went legal. Their attorneys filed yesterday. They're claiming breach of contract on the downtown development deal. How much? $22 million, plus damages. Caroline's breath caught. Not audibly. She'd been raised in this family, trained in the same school of controlled expression as her mother, but internally the number landed like a fist. Vivian was handling that. Vivian was holding it together with phone calls and personal relationships and the kind of diplomatic talent that this family doesn't possess and never has. She had Henderson's people calmed down. She had a resolution framework drafted. I found it in her files. So use it. It's 6 months old. The situation has changed. Henderson's lawyers have been building a case since the day Vivian left, and without her managing the relationship, there was nobody to see it coming. Caroline went upstairs and knocked on Ethan's door. No answer. She knocked again. Go away. I'm coming in. She opened the door. The smell hit her first. Stale air, unwashed clothes, the sour tang of a body that had been marinating in bourbon and self-destruction for almost a month. Ethan was on the couch, not the bed. The couch where she guessed Vivian used to sit when she was keeping him company through the sleepless nights that his chest injury still caused. Henderson filed a lawsuit, $22 million. He didn't move. Ethan, did you hear me? I heard you. And what do you want me to do about it, Caroline? I can barely get dressed in the morning. I haven't slept more than 3 hours in a row since she left. My chest feels like it's full of glass again, which is probably psychosomatic, but that doesn't make it hurt less. What exactly do you think I'm going to contribute to a $22 million legal crisis right now? I think you could start by showering. That's helpful. I'm not trying to be helpful. I'm trying to keep this family from imploding. She sat on the arm of the couch, ignoring the mess. I found her files, Ethan. All of them. She had systems for everything. Client management, family medical records, your recovery protocols. She even had contingency plans for what to do if you started drinking again. Something in his face shifted. A tremor around the mouth that he suppressed almost immediately. Of course she did. She was running this family. I know. Did Mom know? Mom knew. Mom didn't care. Or she cared, but it made her angrier because it meant she needed Vivian, and needing Vivian was something she couldn't tolerate. Why not? Ethan sat up. It took him effort, the kind of effort that made Caroline realize how much physical strength he'd lost in the weeks since Vivian had stopped monitoring his health. Because Mom built her entire identity on this family, being self-sufficient, on the Calloway name being enough. And Vivian was living proof that it wasn't. Every time Vivian fixed something, every time she saved a deal or caught a crisis before it blew up,
It reminded Mom that the empire she's so proud of was standing on the back of a woman from downstate Illinois who didn't come from anything. That's not a reason to hate someone. It's the only reason people like Mom hate anyone, not because the person is bad, because the person is necessary. And people like Mom can't stand being dependent on anyone they consider beneath them. Caroline looked at her brother in the dim room and recognized, with the quiet shock of someone seeing a familiar landscape from a new angle, that he was the most honest she had ever seen him. Stripped of his charm, his business persona, his carefully constructed Callaway composure, Ethan was just a man who had lost the one person who saw him clearly and loved him anyway. "Do you know where she went?" "No." "Have you tried to find her?" "No." "Why not?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head hanging, the posture of surrender. "Because she left for a reason, and the reason was us, all of us, me included. I watched my mother tear her apart for 4 years, and I kept saying I'd handle it, and I never did. I chose comfort over confrontation every single time, and she paid for it.
She paid for it with pieces of herself that she's never going to get back. So that's it? You just let her go? I didn't let her go. I lost her. There's a difference. Letting go implies I had a choice. I ran out of choices the first time I watched Mom treat her like a servant and didn't say a word. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that expensive homes specialize in, where the silence itself feels curated, designed to suggest peace rather than the absence of the life that used to fill it. Downstairs, Margaret sat alone in the dining room, where a month ago she'd told Vivian that the family would handle its own business. The table was set for one. The chair where Vivian used to sit was pushed in tight against the table, as if someone had decided that removing the evidence of her presence would somehow undo the fact that she had ever been there. Margaret's phone buzzed, a text from the family's accountant. She opened it and read the message twice because the first time she was certain she'd misunderstood. The charitable foundation that Vivian had been managing, the one Margaret had dismissed as a vanity project, had 3 outstanding grant commitments totaling $1.8 million. The donors who had pledged the matching funds had made those pledges directly to Vivian, not to the Callaway name, to Vivian. And without Vivian to maintain those relationships, every single donor had withdrawn. Margaret set the phone down. She picked up her coffee cup and realized it was empty. She held the empty cup in her hand for a long time, staring at the place where Vivian used to sit. And for the first time in her life, she felt the particular vertigo of a woman who has spent decades building walls and is only now beginning to understand that she has walled out the very thing that was holding the roof up. The house phone rang. Richard answered it in the other room. His voice carried through the walls, tight and controlled. "When? How much?" "No, don't tell me on the phone. I'll come in." He appeared in the dining room doorway. His face had the color of old cement. The IRS flagged the 2022 filing. They're opening a formal audit. Margaret's hand tightened around the empty cup. The 2022 filing that Vivian organized. The 2022 filing that Vivian organized correctly and that someone in accounting modified after she flagged it for review. She left notes. I found them in her files. She caught the discrepancy and recommended correction. Nobody listened. The cup cracked in Margaret's grip. A thin line running through the bone china, not enough to break it apart, but enough to make it useless for holding anything. She set it down on the table and stared at the hairline fracture spreading through the white surface like a map of everything she had failed to see, and the dining room was so quiet that the sound of the foundation shifting beneath them, 40 years of Callaway certainty beginning its slow, irreversible slide toward collapse, was almost loud enough to hear. The IRS audit letter arrived on a Monday. 47 pages of documentation requests, flagged line items, and the particular bureaucratic language that turns ordinary sentences into threats. Richard spread the pages across the conference table in the family's home office and stared at them the way a man stares at a flood he cannot stop. Margaret stood at the window with her back to the room. Her reflection in the glass was perfect. Posture erect, hands clasped, chin level. But the reflection lied the way reflections always lie. Showing only the surface while the structure underneath shifted and buckled under weight, it was never designed to bear alone. "How much exposure are we looking at?" she asked without turning. "Worst case, Between penalties, back taxes, and legal fees, north of $8 million. That's manageable. It's manageable if we weren't already bleeding from the Henderson lawsuit, the Morrison pullout, and the 3 other clients who've gone quiet in the last 2 weeks. Stack it all together and we're looking at a liquidity crisis by end of quarter. Margaret turned from the window. Her face had the composed stillness of a woman who had survived her husband's death, the near death of her son, and 30 years of boardroom warfare without once letting anyone see her flinch. But something had changed in the geometry of her expression. The angles were sharper. The control was costing more. Vivian flagged this, the 2022 discrepancy. She flagged it, documented it, and recommended a voluntary correction that would have cost us a fraction of what this audit is going to cost. Her memo is dated 14 months ago. It was addressed to Gerald in accounting. Gerald ignored it. Why? Because Gerald doesn't take instructions from someone he considers the boss's wife playing office. His words, not mine. I found the email chain in Vivian's files. The silence that followed had a texture to it, dense, suffocating, the kind of silence that fills a room when the truth is so obvious that speaking it feels redundant. Margaret had built a hierarchy in which Vivian occupied no official position, held no recognized authority, and existed in the organizational structure as a wife, a word that in the Callaway vocabulary carried all the legal weight of a marriage certificate and none of the operational respect that Vivian's actual contributions deserved. And now that hierarchy was eating them alive. Richard pulled a chair out and sat down heavily. He was 63 years old, a man who had managed wealth for 4 decades with the steady hand of someone who understood that money was not a destination but a current, and the current was now running in the wrong direction. There's something else. Of course there is. The foundation donors, the ones who withdrew when Vivian left. One of them is Patricia Whitmore. Margaret's jaw tightened. Patricia Whitmore sat on the boards of 4 major Chicago institutions. She was the kind of woman whose opinion didn't just influence decisions. It shaped the landscape in which decisions were made. Losing Patricia Whitmore's support wasn't a financial problem. It was a reputational one. I'll call Patricia. You can try, but Patricia didn't pledge to the Callaway Foundation. She pledged to Vivian. She told me that directly when I called to salvage the relationship last week. She pledged to a foundation that bears our name. She pledged to a woman she trusted. And when I asked her why she trusted Vivian specifically, you know what she said? She said Vivian was the only person in our family who ever asked her about her work instead of her money. Margaret sat down. The motion was controlled, deliberate, but Caroline, who had been standing in the doorway listening for the last 5 minutes, noticed that her mother's hand trembled slightly as she pulled the chair forward. A tremor so small it could have been nothing. Or it could have been the first visible evidence that the foundation Margaret Callaway had built her entire identity on was no longer solid ground. Caroline stepped into the room. I went through more of Vivian's files last night. Margaret looked at her. I wasn't aware there were more. There are boxes, Mom, 3 of them, in the guest office closet. She kept records of everything. Everything meaning what? Caroline set a manila folder on the table. Inside were printed emails, handwritten notes, and a timeline that covered the last 4 years in meticulous detail. 2 years ago, when the City Planning Commission was going to deny the permit for the Wacker Drive development, you remember that? The deal that saved our commercial portfolio? Richard handled that. Richard shook his head slowly. I handled the paperwork. Vivian handled the commissioner. She spent 3 months building a relationship with Maria Estrada on the planning board. Coffee meetings, community roundtable introductions, a volunteering partnership between our foundation and Estrada's affordable housing nonprofit. By the time the permit vote came up, Estrada was our strongest advocate. I didn't even know about it until after the vote passed. Margaret stared at the folder. 3 years ago, Caroline continued, her voice steady but carrying the particular weight of someone delivering testimony they know will change the shape of every conversation that follows. When the Tribune was investigating allegations of labor violations at the Callaway construction sites, you told everyone the story died because it wasn't credible. It didn't die because it wasn't credible. It died because Vivian spent 2 weeks personally visiting every subcontractor site, documenting conditions, identifying violations, and implementing corrections before the reporter could file. She then met with the reporter herself, showed the documentation of voluntary compliance, and the story was killed. Not because it was false, but because Vivian had already fixed the problems. The room was still. Margaret's hands were flat on the table, fingers slightly spread, as if she were trying to hold the surface steady. She never told me any of this. She never told anyone, that's the point. Caroline pulled another document from the folder. 18 months ago, the incident with Ethan at the Drake Hotel. Margaret's eyes went hard. We don't discuss that. We're discussing it now because Vivian was the one who got the call at 2 a.m. She was the one who drove downtown, talked the hotel management out of calling the police, paid for the damages out of her personal savings. Not the family account, her savings, and got Ethan home without a single media outlet catching wind of it. She then spent the next 3 days detoxing him herself, because she knew that if he went to a facility, the admission would be documented, and the family's insurance carrier would flag it, and our liability premiums would spike. Richard was staring at the documents with the expression of a man watching a ledger he thought he understood, revealing entries he never knew existed. She used her own money? $14,000. She never submitted it for reimbursement. Why not? Because submitting it would have meant explaining what happened. And explaining what happened would have meant exposing Ethan. And exposing Ethan would have meant embarrassing the family. So she ate the cost, the way she ate every cost, because that's what she did. Margaret stood. The motion was abrupt, not her usual calculated rise, but something closer to a reflex, the body's instinct to move when the ground underneath stops being reliable. She walked to the window again, and this time her reflection showed something different. Not the composed matriarch who had governed this family with the precision of a woman who believed that control was the highest form of love. Something raw, something that looked uncomfortably like the face of a person realizing they have been wrong about something fundamental for a very long time. I thought I was protecting this family, she said. Her voice was quiet. Not soft. Margaret Calloway did not do soft, but stripped of the armored cadence that usually made every sentence sound like a verdict. You were protecting the name, Caroline said. Vivian was protecting the people. The words landed, and Margaret absorbed them the way old stone absorbs rain, slowly, reluctantly, through cracks that had been forming long before anyone thought to look. Ethan appeared in the doorway. He looked worse than he had a week ago, thinner. The color in his face had the yellowish cast of a man whose liver was beginning to register its complaints. But his eyes were clear. Not sober clear. Vivian would have known the difference. But the clarity that comes from having hit a floor hard enough to feel the concrete. I heard, he said. Caroline told me about the files. Ethan, you should be resting, Margaret started. I should be a lot of things. He walked into the room and picked up the manila folder. His hands were steady enough to hold it, but not steady enough to hide the effort. The Drake Hotel. She told me she paid for that out of household expenses. She lied to protect me from knowing she'd used her own money. She lied so I wouldn't feel guilty about it. He set the folder down and looked at his mother with an expression that Caroline had never seen on his face before. Not anger. Something past anger. The desolate recognition that comes when you finally understand the full scope of what you failed to deserve. She carried us, Mom. All of us. For 4 years she carried us, and we didn't just fail to thank her, we punished her for it. You punished her for it. Every dinner where you talked over her, every meeting you excluded her from, every time you reminded her that she was Ethan's wife and not a Calloway. She was doing more for this family than any of us, and you treated her like she was something you needed to tolerate. I did what I thought was right. You did what was easy. There's a difference. Keeping Vivian at arm's length was easy. Acknowledging what she contributed would have meant admitting you needed her, and you couldn't do that because needing someone you consider beneath you is the one thing your pride can't survive. Margaret's chin lifted. The old reflex, the automatic reassertion of authority that had served her for decades. But this time the gesture looked less like strength and more like a muscle memory that the body performs even when the will behind it has begun to fail. I will not be lectured in my own home. This isn't a lecture. This is a reckoning. And it's happening whether you want it to or not, because in about 6 weeks, The IRS is going to open an audit that Vivian tried to prevent. Henderson's lawyers are going to push a case that Vivian was resolving. Our reputation is going to take hits that Vivian spent years quietly deflecting. And when all of that comes down at once, the only person who could have navigated us through it is gone, because you drove her out. The room held its breath. The afternoon light coming through the windows was the flat gray light of a Chicago autumn, the kind that makes everything look honest and unforgiving. Margaret stood in that light, and for the first time in anyone's memory, she did not have a response. Not because she didn't have words. Margaret Calloway always had words. But because the words she had, the justifications, the rationalizations, the carefully constructed arguments about family standards and appropriate boundaries and the importance of maintaining the hierarchy that had served the Calloways for 3 generations, all of those words suddenly felt like currency from a country that no longer existed. She had spent 4 years building a case against Vivian Hart, against her background, her manners, her lack of social pedigree, her presumption in inserting herself into family affairs that Margaret believed should remain the exclusive province of people who bore the Calloway name by birth or by long institutional association. And every piece of evidence in that case had just been dismantled by a folder full of documents proving that the woman Margaret had judged unworthy was the only person who had been doing the work of keeping the family alive. There is a particular kind of ruin that doesn't come from enemies. It comes from the slow, meticulous destruction of the very thing you needed most, carried out with the absolute certainty that you were doing the right thing. Margaret Calloway had not been defeated by a rival or a market crash or a political betrayal. She had been defeated by her own judgment, which she had trusted above all things and which had failed her in the one area where failure was irreversible. She sat down again. The motion was slow this time. An old woman's motion, although Margaret was only 61 and had never moved like an old woman before. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. The question was directed at no one in particular, or perhaps at everyone, or perhaps at the empty chair across the table where Vivian used to sit, the chair that Margaret had once looked at and seen an intruder and now looked at and saw the outline of the only person who had ever held this family together without asking for credit, without demanding recognition, without ever once throwing back in their faces the catalog of sacrifices she had made on their behalf. Ethan answered first. "I want to find her." "And then what?" "And then I want to apologize. Not the kind of apology you make to close a deal, a real one, the kind that costs something." "Apologies don't fix audits, Ethan." "No, but they fix people. And right now, the people in this family are more broken than the books." Caroline pulled out her phone. "I've been looking, quietly. She's not in Chicago. She's not in Illinois. Her nursing license was transferred to another state 8 weeks ago." "Which state?" "I'm still working on that." Richard cleared his throat. "There's one more thing, and I debated whether to bring it up today, but given the circumstances, I don't think we have the luxury of timing." Everyone looked at him. "I received a call this morning from David Chen at the Tribune. He's running a story on the Henderson lawsuit. Standard business reporting, contract disputes, dollar figures, the usual. But during our conversation, he mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd spoken with Vivian." The room contracted. The air changed. Margaret's head turned toward Richard, with the sharp precision of a predator hearing movement in the brush. "He spoke with Vivian?" "She didn't initiate it. He tracked her down because her name was on the mediation documents from the original Henderson dispute. He wanted background, and she gave it to him." "What did she say?" "She told the truth. That's what she said. She told him that she identified the contract issues, drafted a resolution framework, and recommended voluntary compliance. She told him that her recommendations were ignored by family members who didn't consider her input relevant. And she told him, and this is the part that's going to matter, that she has documentation of every recommendation she made and every time it was dismissed." Ethan sat down. The slow collapse of a man whose legs have decided they are done supporting him. "She's not trying to hurt us," he said. "That's not who she is. It doesn't matter what she's trying to do. What matters is what the documentation shows. And what it shows is a pattern of a family that systematically ignored the advice of the most competent person in the room because she didn't have the right last name." Margaret's hands were in her lap now, hidden. The tremor that had started as something barely visible had become something she needed to conceal. "If that story runs, when that story runs. When that story runs, it's not just the Henderson case. It's every relationship, every deal, every piece of our reputation that we've built over 40 years. All of it gets reframed. We go from being a family that suffered an unfortunate contract dispute to being a family that destroyed the one person who was holding us together. And that narrative, that's not something you recover from with a press release. The gray light continued to pour through the windows, flat and unforgiving, illuminating every surface in the room with the kind of honesty that expensive curtains were designed to prevent. Margaret Calloway sat in that light and felt the full weight of a truth she had spent 4 years refusing to see, a truth that was now about to become public, documented, undeniable. She had not just lost Vivian Hart, she had created the evidence of her own failure, page by page, decision by decision, dismissal by dismissal, until the record of her contempt had become the instrument of her undoing. And somewhere out there, in a state Caroline hadn't identified yet, a woman who had once saved her son's life, and then spent 4 years saving the rest of them, was sitting with a journalist's phone number in her recent calls, and the quiet, terrible power of someone who has nothing left to lose and the truth on her side. Caroline found her in Nashville. It took 11 days, a private investigator Ethan hired without telling Margaret, and a chain of nursing license transfer records that led from Illinois to Tennessee. Vivian Hart, she had gone back to using her maiden name, which told them everything about how thoroughly she had cut the Calloway identity out of herself, was working as the clinical director of a free healthcare clinic on the south side of the city. She had rented a 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store. She drove a used Subaru. She was by every measurable standard starting over from nothing, except it wasn't nothing. Caroline learned this when the investigator's report came back with details that went beyond the address and phone number she'd requested. Vivian had incorporated a nonprofit foundation, Heart Health Initiative, 6 weeks after leaving Chicago. She had already secured a partnership with Vanderbilt's community health program. She had 3 volunteer physicians on rotation, a grant application pending with the state health department, and a waiting room that was full every morning by 7 a.m. In 2 months, Vivian Hart had built from scratch what most people couldn't build in 2 years. And she had done it without the Calloway money, the Calloway name, or the Calloway connections that Margaret had spent decades convincing everyone were the only things that mattered. Caroline brought the report to Ethan. He read it sitting on the edge of his bed, still unshowered, still wearing the same clothes from the day before. But his hands didn't shake when he held the pages, and his eyes tracked each line with the focus of a man who was reading his own verdict. "She's doing it," he said. "She's doing what she always did, taking care of people. Without us. Without anyone." He set the report down and stared at the wall. The late afternoon light made long shadows across the room, the kind that stretch and distort until familiar shapes become unrecognizable. "I need to go to Nashville." "Ethan, I know what you're going to say. I'm going to say that showing up unannounced at the door of a woman who left you because you failed to protect her from your own family is not a plan. It's an ambush." "Then what do you suggest?" "I suggest you get sober first, actually sober, not white-knuckling it through the afternoon sober. I suggest you figure out what you're actually going to say to her. And I suggest you talk to Mom before you go, because if you show up at Vivian's door while Mom is still pretending none of this is her fault, nothing changes. Vivian didn't leave you. She left the system. And Mom is the system." Ethan knew his sister was right. He knew it the way a man knows the water is cold before he jumps. Intellectually, completely, and with the full understanding that knowing doesn't make the jump any less brutal. He stopped drinking that night. Not gradually. Not with medical supervision. Cold. The way Vivian had taught him soldiers did it in the field when there was no time for protocols and the only option was to choose the pain over the alternative. The first 3 days were the worst, sweating through sheets, hands trembling so badly he couldn't hold a glass of water without spilling it, his body punishing him for the months of abuse he'd put it through, every cell rebelling against the sudden absence of the chemical crutch he'd been leaning on since Vivian walked out. On the 4th day, he got up, showered, put on clean clothes, and went downstairs. Margaret was in the sitting room. She had been spending more time there lately, in the chair by the window, with a cup of coffee that she sometimes drank and sometimes just held. The woman who had once commanded every room she entered now occupied this one with the diminished presence of someone who had begun to doubt whether the room still belonged to her. "We need to talk," Ethan said. "About what?" "About Vivian. About Nashville. About the fact that I'm going to find her, and that before I do, you and I are going to have the conversation we should have had 4 years ago." Margaret set her coffee down. The motion was steady. Whatever tremor had appeared weeks ago had been trained back into submission because Margaret Calloway could command her body even when she could no longer command the circumstances around her. "Sit down." He sat, across from her, close enough to see the lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago, the faint hollowing of cheeks that came from meals she was eating alone now that the dining room had become a room nobody wanted to sit in. "Why did you hate her?" he asked. "I didn't hate her. Mom, I didn't hate her. I was afraid of her." The admission landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Ethan stared at his mother. In 35 years of knowing this woman, he had never heard her use the word afraid in reference to herself. Margaret Calloway feared nothing. That was the foundational myth of the family, the bedrock on which every decision, every power play, every act of social warfare had been built. Margaret feared nothing, and therefore nothing could touch her. Afraid of what? Of what she represented. Margaret's voice was low but clear. The voice of a woman who had decided to tell the truth and was discovering that truth had a different weight than the carefully constructed narratives she usually carried. "Your father built this family. He built it with his name, his connections, his reputation. When he died, I took over because there was no one else, and I held it together. Every board meeting, every social function, every crisis. I held it together because I believed that the Calloway name was enough, that it had to be enough. Because if it wasn't, then everything your father built, everything I sacrificed to maintain, was built on nothing." "And Vivian?" "Vivian walked in and did more for this family in 6 months than I had done in 6 years. Not because she was smarter or more capable, although she was both, but because she cared about the people, not the name. She called clients because she wanted to know how they were doing, not because she wanted to maintain a relationship. She managed Ethan's health because she loved him, not because his well-being was an asset to protect. Everything she did came from something genuine, and everything I did came from obligation and fear and the desperate need to prove that this family didn't need anything it couldn't provide for itself." She paused. Her hands were in her lap again, but this time she wasn't hiding a tremor. She was holding her own fingers the way a person holds something fragile. "She made me feel like a fraud because she was the real thing and I was the performance." The sitting room was quiet. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked, the mechanical heartbeat of a home that had been measuring time in the same steady intervals for decades, indifferent to the human damage accumulating between its walls. "That's not a reason to destroy someone," Ethan said. "No, it's not." "She spent her own money to cover my incident at the Drake. $14,000. She never told me." "I know. Richard showed me the records." "She stopped a Tribune investigation by personally fixing the labor violations on our construction sites." "I know. She saved the Wacker Drive development." "I know all of it, Ethan. Caroline showed me the files, every page, every document, every record of everything she did that I either didn't see or refused to see." "And?" Margaret looked at her son. The look was unguarded in a way that made Ethan's chest hurt, not from the old injury but from the deeper one, the one that came from watching a woman he had both loved and resented his entire life finally stop pretending she was something she wasn't. "And I was wrong. I have been wrong for 4 years. I was wrong about her place in this family, wrong about her motives, wrong about what she was and what she deserved. I drove away the best thing that ever happened to this family, and I did it because she threatened the lie I had been telling myself since your father died." "What lie?" "That being a Calloway was enough, that the name was the thing that mattered. She proved it wasn't. She proved that what matters is what you do, not what you're called. And I couldn't forgive her for that." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, the posture of a man who has been carrying something heavy and is looking for a place to set it down. "I'm going to Nashville." "I know." "I'm going to ask her to come back." "She won't." "Probably not."
Not because of you, because of me. Then come with me. Margaret's breath caught. A small sound, almost inaudible.
But Ethan heard it because he had spent 4 years living with Vivian, and Vivian had taught him, without ever explicitly teaching him, how to listen for the sounds people make when they're trying not to break. I can't. You can. You just don't want to. I don't deserve to. Nobody deserves anything, Mom. That's what Vivian would say. Deserving isn't the point. Doing is the point. Showing up is the point. Being willing to stand in front of someone you've hurt and letting them see you without the armor. That's the point. Margaret closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had shifted. Not the dramatic transformation of a woman reborn, not the cinematic moment of sudden clarity. Something quieter than that. The slow, painful decision of a person who has spent a lifetime being strong in all the wrong ways and is now choosing to be vulnerable in the one way that matters. When do we leave? They flew to Nashville 3 days later. Margaret, Ethan, and Caroline. Richard stayed behind to manage the ongoing legal disasters, armed with the documentation from Vivian's files and the grudging cooperation of an attorney who had been shocked to discover that the most thorough legal preparation in the Callaway archive had been done by a former combat medic with no law degree. The clinic was on a street in South Nashville that bore no resemblance to Michigan Avenue. No marble facades, no security details, a converted storefront with a hand-painted sign that read Heart Health Initiative, and underneath, in smaller letters, Everyone deserves care. Ethan stood on the sidewalk and looked at that sign and felt something move in his chest that had nothing to do with the old injury. The understanding that Vivian had taken the very thing his family had denied her, care, recognition, the simple acknowledgement that she mattered, and had built it into a mission for strangers. She had turned her wound into a door and opened it for people who had no one else to open doors for them. Margaret stood beside him. She was wearing a simple coat, no jewelry, flat shoes. She had dressed down for the first time in Ethan's memory, as if she understood that arriving at Vivian's door, in the armor of wealth and status, would be the final insult in a long catalog of insults that she could no longer afford to extend. "I'll go in first," Ethan said. "No." Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. "I will." She walked into the clinic alone. The waiting room was full, mothers with children, elderly men in work clothes, a teenage girl with a cough she was trying to hide behind her sleeve. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes and an efficient manner that reminded Margaret, painfully, of Vivian, looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Vivian Hart." "Do you have an appointment?" "No, my name is Margaret Callaway. She'll know who I am." The receptionist's expression shifted, just slightly, enough to tell Margaret that Vivian had mentioned the Callaways at some point, and that whatever she had said had been measured enough to earn the cautious, protective look, now being directed at the woman who had caused the damage. "I'll check if she's available. Please have a seat." Margaret sat in the waiting room of a free clinic on the south side of Nashville, surrounded by the kind of people she had spent her entire life insulating herself from, and waited. The plastic chair was uncomfortable. The magazine on the table beside her was 6 months old. The fluorescent lights hummed with the same particular frequency that Vivian had once listened to during her shifts at Cook County. 7 minutes passed. Each one felt like a year lived in real time. Every second weighted with the accumulated cost of every dismissal, every cutting remark, every carefully aimed reminder that Vivian Hart was not and would never be a Callaway. The door to the back offices opened. Vivian stood there. She looked different. Not physically, although she was thinner, harder, with the particular leanness that comes from building something with your own hands, but in the way she occupied space. In Chicago, Vivian had always carried herself with a controlled containment, as if she were consciously making herself smaller to fit the space the Callaways had allocated for her. Here, in her own clinic, in the institution she had built from nothing, she stood at full height. She filled the doorway. She was not diminished. Margaret stood. The two women faced each other across 10 feet of linoleum and 4 years of damage that could not be measured in distance. "Vivian." "Margaret." I need to." Margaret stopped. reorganized. In 61 years, she had never struggled to complete a sentence. But standing in front of Vivian Hart, in a clinic that Vivian had built by being everything Margaret had refused to let her be, the words she had prepared on the plane, careful, diplomatic, calibrated, felt like counterfeit currency. Worthless. Insulting. Another performance from a woman who had performed her way through life and was now standing in front of the one person who had always seen through every performance. I came to tell you that you were right about everything, and I was wrong about everything. Vivian's expression didn't change. She stood in the doorway with her arms at her sides and her eyes steady, and the particular stillness of a woman who has been waiting for this moment without ever expecting it to arrive. "Come in," she said. "We'll talk in my office." She turned and walked down the hallway. Margaret followed. Through the narrow corridor of a converted storefront in South Nashville, past exam rooms and supply closets and hand-drawn thank you cards from patients taped to the walls, into a small office at the back where the desk was covered in grant applications and the window looked out onto a parking lot, and the only decoration was a framed copy of Vivian's Army discharge papers, the document that represented the first institution that had ever looked at her and seen someone worth investing in. Vivian sat behind her desk. Margaret sat across from her. The dynamic was reversed now. Vivian behind the desk, Margaret in the visitor's chair. The geography of power had shifted completely, and both women knew it. "Ethan is outside," Margaret said. "I know. I saw him through the window. He's sober. 4 days. 4 days isn't sober. 4 days is still deciding. He's deciding." "Good." Silence. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the sounds of the waiting room, a child coughing, the receptionist answering the phone, the ordinary machinery of a place dedicated to the simple radical act of caring for people who had nowhere else to go. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, and that was when the receptionist knocked on the door. "Vivian, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a man here, says his name is David Chen, from the Chicago Tribune. He says you're expecting him." Vivian looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Vivian. And in the space between them, the entire future of the Calloway family hung on whatever Vivian Hart was about to say next. Vivian looked at the receptionist, then at Margaret. The moment held the weight of every choice she had made in the last 4 years and every choice she was about to make in the next 30 seconds. "Tell Mr. Chen I'll be with him in 10 minutes. The receptionist nodded and closed the door. Margaret's hands tightened in her lap. The involuntary reflex of a woman who understood that 10 minutes was either a reprieve or a countdown. "Vivian, if that story runs, I know what happens if it runs." "Then you understand what I'm asking." "You're not asking anything, Margaret. You're sitting in my office hoping I'll protect your family one more time. That's what you came here to do. That's what Ethan is doing on that sidewalk. Not because you've changed, because you need something." The words landed with surgical precision. Vivian delivered them without malice, without raised voice, without the theatrical anger that Margaret might have found easier to absorb. This was worse. This was the calm, clinical assessment of a woman who had spent enough years in operating rooms and combat zones to know the difference between a wound that could heal and one that couldn't. Margaret swallowed. The sound was audible in the small office. "You're right. Part of why I came is because we need you. I won't pretend otherwise, but that's not all of it." "Then tell me the rest." "I was afraid of you. I told Ethan that 3 days ago, and it was the first honest thing I've said about you in 4 years. I was afraid because you were better at being a Calloway than any of us. You cared about people. Not positions, not appearances, not the name on the building. People. And that terrified me because it meant everything I'd built my life on. The standards, the hierarchy, the belief that pedigree was the same thing as value. All of it was wrong. You proved it was wrong just by being who you are." Vivian listened. Her face gave away nothing. The discipline of a woman who had learned to triage emotions the same way she triaged casualties. Assess, stabilize, decide what can be saved and what has to be let go. "That's a start," she said. "But words are easy for you, Margaret. You've been using them like weapons your whole life. What I need to know is whether anything has actually changed, or whether this is just a more sophisticated version of the same performance." "What would change look like to you?" "It would look like you sitting in that chair and meaning what you say without calculating what you get out of it.
It would look like Ethan getting sober because he wants to be whole, not because he needs me to come back and manage his life. It would look like your family learning to function without someone sacrificing themselves to hold it together. We're trying. Trying is what people say when they haven't started yet. Margaret flinched. The word flinch was inadequate for what actually happened. It was more like a structural shift, the kind of deep internal rearrangement that occurs when a load-bearing wall discovers it has been carrying weight it was never designed to hold. She looked down at her hands, studied them. Hands that had signed contracts and held gavels and gripped the edges of conference tables during negotiations that determined the fate of buildings and businesses and the livelihoods of hundreds of people. Hands that had never, in 61 years, been folded in genuine surrender. She folded them now. I don't know how to do this. I have controlled every conversation I've had for 30 years. I have walked into rooms and known exactly what to say and how to say it and what outcome I was engineering. And right now, sitting here, I don't have a strategy. I don't have a talking point. I have nothing except the knowledge that I destroyed something I should have protected, and I don't know how to fix it because fixing things has always meant controlling them, and I can't control this. Vivian watched her. The clock ticked. Outside, a car horn sounded on the street. The ordinary noise of a city going about its business, while two women sat across a desk and negotiated something more complex than any deal the Callaway Empire had ever brokered. "I'm not coming back to Chicago," Vivian said. "I know. I'm not giving up this clinic. I'm not giving up the foundation. I built this. It's mine. Not because someone gave it to me or because I married into it, but because I put it together with my own hands and my own money and my own time. I know. And I'm not going to be the person who holds your family together anymore. That job nearly killed me. Not physically. I've survived worse than your dinner table. But the part of me that believed I deserved to be treated like a person and not a utility, that part almost didn't survive." Margaret nodded. The motion was small, barely perceptible. But Vivian saw it because Vivian had spent 4 years learning to read the microscopic signals of a woman who communicated in increments. "Then what can I do?" "You can start by being honest with David Chen yourself." Margaret's head came up. "He's here for a story about a family that failed. You can either let him write that story from the outside, which means he'll write it based on documents and speculation and whatever narrative sells the most copies. Or you can sit down with him and tell him the truth. All of it. What you did, why you did it, and what it cost. Not because it saves the family's reputation. It won't. But because it's the first real thing you'll have done in 4 years." The suggestion was so far outside the operational parameters of Margaret Callaway's existence that for a moment she simply stared at Vivian as if the words had been spoken in a foreign language. Margaret Callaway did not give interviews. She did not expose vulnerability to journalists. She did not hand ammunition to people who could use it against her. But Margaret Callaway had also never sat in a folding chair in a free clinic and asked a woman she'd spent 4 years diminishing what she could do to make it right. The old rules were already broken. The old architecture was already rubble. What she was being asked to do now was not surrender. It was something harder. It was choosing to be seen as she actually was, instead of as she had always insisted on being perceived. "I'll talk to him," Margaret said. "Tell him the truth." "The whole truth?" "The whole truth, including the parts that make you look terrible, especially those parts." Margaret stood. She straightened her coat. The gesture was automatic, the muscle memory of a woman who had always used her appearance as armor. But this time the armor felt different, lighter, less like protection, and more like the last remnant of a costume she was finally taking off. She walked to the door, stopped, turned back. "For what it's worth, and I know it's not worth much, I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry that comes with conditions or expectations. Just sorry. For the lilies at your wedding. For every dinner where I made you feel like you didn't belong. For the 4 years of damage that I can't undo and don't deserve to have forgiven." "I know," Vivian said. Margaret opened the door and walked down the hallway toward the waiting room where David Chen was sitting with a notebook and a recorder and the expectation that he was about to get a story about a powerful family's failures. He was right. But the story he was about to get was not the one he'd come for. It was going to be told by the woman who had caused the damage, in her own words,
without deflection or spin or the careful corporate language that families like the Callaways use to turn accountability into abstraction. Vivian sat alone in her office for a long time after Margaret left. The grant applications on her desk needed attention. The afternoon patients would be arriving soon. The work, the steady, grounding, endlessly demanding work of caring for people who had no safety net, was waiting for her the way it always waited, patient and necessary, and completely indifferent to whatever drama was playing out in her personal life. She looked at the framed discharge papers on her wall. Specialist Vivian Hart. Honorable discharge. The document that represented the first time anyone had looked at her and said, "You did enough. You gave enough. You can stop now." She had never been able to stop. That was the thing about people who had been taking care of others since before they were old enough to take care of themselves. The mechanism didn't have an off switch. It just ran and ran and ran until the person it was running inside either found a way to direct it towards something worthy or let it consume them in service of people who never noticed. She had almost let it consume her. The Callaway years had been a slow burning, the kind that doesn't leave visible scars because the damage is all internal. The erosion of self-worth that happens when you pour yourself into a system that refuses to acknowledge you exist. She had left Chicago not because she was broken, but because she had felt herself approaching the breakpoint and had enough training to recognize what that looked like and enough self-preservation to walk away before she crossed it. A knock on the door. She knew who it was before she opened it. Ethan stood in the hallway. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him. Thinner, yes. Older. But there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The raw, unprotected quality of a man who had stopped hiding behind the version of himself that had been designed for public consumption. "Can I come in?" "Yes." He sat in the chair his mother had just left. The same folding chair, the same small office, the same fluorescent light that didn't flatter anyone, that showed every line and shadow and imperfection with the democratic honesty of cheap lighting. "I'm 7 days sober." "I know. Caroline texted me." "She's been texting you?" "Since the second week. She found my number in the files." He absorbed this. The understanding that his sister had been maintaining a line of communication with Vivian that he hadn't known about. It didn't anger him. It made him realize that Caroline, of all of them, might have been the first to understand what Vivian's absence actually meant. "I'm not here to ask you to come back." "Good. Because I'm not coming back." "I know. I'm here to tell you something I should have told you every day for 4 years and never did." "Ethan, let me finish, please." She nodded. "You saved my life, not just in the hospital, every day after that. You saved my business, my health, my sanity, and probably my family, although they're going to have to figure out how to save themselves now. And the whole time you were saving all of that, I stood there and watched my mother treat you like you were disposable. And I didn't stop it. Not because I didn't see it, I saw every single moment, but because stopping it would have meant confronting her, and confronting my mother was the one thing I was never brave enough to do." He paused. His breathing was uneven, not from the old chest injury, but from the particular labor of speaking truths that have been held too long. "You were braver than anyone in my family. You walked into our world with nothing, no connections, no money, no social armor, and you held us together with your bare hands. And when we refused to see it, you didn't scream or fight or demand what you deserved. You just left, quietly, completely, the way only someone who has truly given up on being valued can leave." Vivian's eyes were bright, not with tears. Vivian Hart did not cry easily, and when she did, it was a private event that she allowed no one, not even herself, to witness fully, but with the particular shine that comes from hearing someone finally say the thing you needed to hear years ago. "What do you want, Ethan?" "I want to earn you back. Not have you back, earn you back. However long that takes, whatever it looks like. I'll move to Nashville. I'll sleep on a park bench. I'll volunteer at your clinic and mop floors and do whatever it takes to prove that I'm not the man who sat in silence while his mother tore you apart." "That's a nice speech." "It's not a speech. Speeches are what my family does. This is me standing in a fluorescent-lit office in South Nashville telling the only woman I've ever loved that I know, I don't deserve another chance, and I'm asking for one anyway."
The afternoon light had shifted while they talked. The parking lot outside the window was filling up with the cars of patients arriving for the afternoon clinic hours. Soon Vivian would need to be in the exam rooms, doing the work that gave her days their shape and meaning. The work that had saved her the way she had once saved Ethan, by giving her something to do with the part of herself that couldn't stop caring. "You can start by volunteering," she said. "We need someone to organize the supply closet. It's a mess." He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not hope exactly, because hope implies expectation, and Ethan Calloway had learned in the last 2 months that expectation was a luxury he could no longer afford. Something quieter. The first tremor of possibility in a landscape that had been frozen solid. "Supply closet. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 7 a.m. Don't be late." "I won't be late." "And Ethan." "Yeah. This doesn't mean we're back together. This means you're showing up. That's all it means for now. Showing up is the beginning, not the end." "I understand." He stood. He didn't reach for her. Didn't try to hug her or kiss her or bridge the distance with a physical gesture that would have felt premature and presumptuous. He just stood there, in her office, in her space, in the world she had built without him, and he let her see that he was willing to start from nothing. Because that was what Vivian had done. She had started from nothing, from a childhood without parents, from a war that left invisible wounds, from a marriage that asked everything and gave nothing. And she had built something real, something that helped people, something that stood on its own foundation and didn't require anyone's last name or bank account or social approval to justify its existence. If Ethan wanted to be part of that, he would have to earn it the way Vivian had earned everything in her life. Not by inheriting it, not by buying it, not by expecting it to be given because of who he was or what his family owned, by doing the work, day after day, without recognition, without gratitude, without the guarantee that the effort would ever be enough. Margaret's interview with David Chen ran in the Tribune the following week. It was not the story anyone expected. Instead of a corporate scandal piece, it read as something closer to a confession. A powerful woman admitting on the record that she had systematically undervalued the person who had held her family together, and that the consequences of that failure had been catastrophic and entirely deserved. The article quoted Margaret directly saying that Vivian Hart was the most capable and courageous person she had ever known, and that driving her away was the worst mistake of her life. The article changed the narrative, not because it saved the Calloway reputation, it didn't, not entirely, but because it introduced something that had been absent from every Calloway interaction for as long as anyone could remember. Honesty, the raw, unvarnished, reputation-damaging kind that strips away pretense and leaves only the truth standing. Ethan moved to Nashville. He rented an apartment 4 blocks from the clinic. He showed up on Tuesday at 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes early, and organized the supply closet with the meticulous focus of a man who understood that this was not a task but a test, and that the test was not about supplies, but about whether he could show up consistently for something that offered no reward beyond the act of showing up itself. Margaret flew down once a month. She didn't stay at the house Ethan rented. She stayed at a modest hotel near the clinic and spent her visits doing whatever Vivian's foundation needed. Fundraising calls, donor meetings, the administrative work that Margaret's decades of social engineering had actually equipped her to do well, when directed towards something that mattered, instead of something that merely impressed. Caroline took over the family's legal problems in Chicago. She hired competent people to replace the competent person they'd lost, and she made sure those people were respected, compensated, and never treated as invisible. The Henderson lawsuit settled for less than projected. The IRS audit concluded with penalties that were painful but survivable. The foundation donors came back slowly, one by one, drawn by the Tribune article, and by the evident transformation of a family that had finally stopped performing and started doing. It took 18 months before Vivian allowed Ethan back into her life as anything more than a volunteer. 18 months of supply closets and Tuesday mornings, and the slow, painstaking reconstruction of trust between two people who both knew that the old version of their relationship was dead and that anything new would have to be built on different ground. They remarried on a Thursday afternoon in the small garden behind the clinic. No white lilies, no bone china, no marble floors. Just a judge, Caroline, 2 of Vivian's clinic nurses, and Margaret,
who stood in the back row in flat shoes and no jewelry and cried for the first time in anyone's memory, not because she was sad, but because she was finally witnessing what a family looked like when it was held together by something real instead of something performed. The Calloway name still meant something in Chicago, but it meant something different now. Not the old meaning, the inherited weight of wealth and status, and the unspoken assumption that pedigree was destiny. The new meaning was built on the foundation that Vivian had laid in a converted storefront in South Nashville, where a woman with no pedigree and no inheritance and nothing but her own two hands had proven that the measure of a family is not what it owns or what it controls, but what it is willing to sacrifice for the people it loves. Vivian kept the clinic. She kept her maiden name on the door. She kept the framed discharge papers on the wall of her office, the document that represented the first time anyone had looked at her and seen someone worth believing in. And on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, when the supply closet was organized and the patients were arriving and the ordinary machinery of caring for people was humming along in its steady, unspectacular way, she would stand in the doorway and watch Ethan Calloway, heir to one of the most powerful families in Chicago, mopping the floors of a free clinic in South Nashville. And she would know, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had survived everything the world had thrown at her, that this was what strength looked like. Not the marble and the money and the name on the building. This, the willingness to start over, the courage to be ordinary, the hard, daily, unglamorous work of becoming the kind of person who deserves what they have been given.